the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable kind that settles into a room after a long speech, but the kind that falls suddenly, like someone flipped a switch on the entire world. 1 second the ballroom was alive with conversation, laughter, the soft clink of crystal glasses. The next second, it was quiet enough that I could hear my own breath. At first, I thought I had done something wrong. I was weaving through the crowd with a silver tray balanced carefully in both hands, trying not to spill the champagne flutes arranged in a perfect circle. Charity galas in Manhattan always looked glamorous from the outside, but from where I stood, they were mostly just hours of smiling politely while my feet ached in shoes that cost $30 too much for my budget. My name is Emily Carter, 24 years old, working 3 catering shifts a week while finishing my last semester of college. That night's event was being held in one of those historic midtown buildings with ceilings that felt a mile high and chandeliers the size of small cars. The guests wore suits that probably cost more than my entire student loan balance. I was invisible to them, which was exactly how waitresses were supposed to be. Move quietly. Refill glasses. Don't interrupt conversations. Don't exist unless someone needed another drink. I had just stepped around a group of investors arguing about real estate when the silence started spreading across the room like a ripple in water. Conversations faded one by one. Heads turned toward the entrance. Even the violinist near the stage stopped mid-note, his bow hovering in the air. I blinked, confused, adjusting the tray in my hands. Something had changed. I could feel it in the air, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. The man beside me straightened his jacket and stepped aside without even looking at me. Another guest did the same. Within seconds, a path began forming through the crowd. I followed their line of sight toward the tall doors at the end of the ballroom just as they opened. The man who walked in didn't raise his voice or make a grand entrance. He simply stepped inside, and somehow the entire room reacted as if gravity had shifted. Tall, at least 6'3", black suit tailored so precisely it looked like it had been sculpted onto him. Dark hair swept back from a sharp, calm face that belonged on the cover of a magazine or carved into stone somewhere in Italy. He moved slowly, confidently, as if the building itself belonged to him. I didn't know his name. Not yet. All I knew was that every powerful person in that ballroom seemed suddenly aware of him. My hands tightened slightly around the tray as I tried to step around another guest, but someone shifted unexpectedly, and my elbow clipped the edge of a table. The tray tipped. For one terrible second, everything moved in slow motion. Then the glasses slid. Crystal struck marble with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent room. Champagne splashed across the polished floor. I froze, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. Dozens of people turned toward me at once. Heat rushed to my face as I crouched instinctively, reaching for the broken pieces. But before I could even touch the floor, I felt it. A weight in the air. The kind you feel when someone is looking directly at you. I slowly lifted my head. Across the ballroom, the man who had just entered had stopped walking. And out of everyone in that enormous room, he was looking straight at me. For a moment no one moved. The broken glass glittered across the marble floor while the last drops of champagne rolled slowly toward the edge of the table like tiny rivers of gold. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it might shake the tray still clutched in my hands. I could feel every eye in the room on me, but the only one that truly mattered was his. The tall man had stopped halfway across the ballroom. He was not angry. He was not surprised. He was simply watching me with a calm focus that made the air feel heavier. I swallowed and quickly crouched down, trying to gather the pieces of glass before anyone else had to deal with my mistake. "I am so sorry," I whispered to no one in particular, even though my voice sounded small in the enormous room. A hand suddenly appeared beside me holding a folded linen napkin. One of the event managers knelt down and helped scoop the broken pieces together. His smile was tight, the kind people wear when they are trying not to panic. "It is fine, Emily," he murmured quickly under his breath. "Just move to the side. We will handle it." But before I could stand up, he leaned closer and added in a barely audible whisper, "You need to step away now." Something in his tone made the back of my neck prickle. I followed his gaze without meaning to and saw that the man in the black suit was still standing exactly where he had stopped. The crowd had shifted slightly around him, leaving an invisible circle of space as if no one wanted to get too close. Two men in dark suits stood several feet behind him, both perfectly still, their attention quietly scanning the room. Whoever this man was, he was clearly important. I pushed myself to my feet and tried to keep my head down, hoping the moment would pass if I simply disappeared back into the flow of the event. My hands were trembling as I placed the empty tray onto a service cart near the wall. The violinist slowly resumed playing, though the melody sounded softer now, cautious. Conversations began again, but they were quieter than before, as if everyone was careful about what they said. I reached for a fresh tray of glasses, determined to keep working and pretend nothing had happened. That was when I heard the manager speaking urgently to another staff member beside me. "Do you know who that is?" he whispered. The other server shook his head. The manager exhaled slowly before answering. "That is Adrian Moretti." The name meant nothing to me at first, but the way he said it made my stomach tighten. I glanced across the ballroom again, without thinking. Adrian Moretti had resumed walking, moving through the crowd with slow, measured steps. Guests greeted him with polite smiles and careful handshakes, but none of them kept him for long. His attention seemed elsewhere. I turned away quickly, telling myself to focus on my job. Refill glasses, clear plates, stay invisible. But every few seconds I felt that strange pressure again, the feeling that someone was studying me from across the room. Finally, I made the mistake of looking up once more. The distance between us had closed without me noticing. He was no longer on the far side of the ballroom. Adrian Moretti was only a few tables away now, and, even with dozens of people surrounding him, his eyes were still locked directly on me. I tried to focus on the tray in front of me, but it was impossible to ignore the way the room seemed to shift around him. People stepped aside before Adrian Moretti even reached them. Conversations shortened. Smiles became more careful. It was the quiet kind of respect that did not need to be announced, the kind that made everyone stand a little straighter. I picked up a fresh tray of champagne glasses and walked slowly along the edge of the ballroom, telling myself there was no reason to panic. He was just another guest. An important guest, maybe, but still just a man attending a charity event like everyone else. That explanation lasted about 5 seconds, because when I glanced up again, he was closer, much closer. Only one table separated us now. A group of investors were speaking to him politely, but their conversation felt secondary, like background noise. His attention drifted past them, straight toward me. I quickly looked down at the tray again, pretending to adjust the glasses. My hands were steady now, but my thoughts were not. Why would someone like him even notice me? I was just part of the staff. Invisible. Replaceable. Exactly the way catering companies designed it to be. One of the guests near me reached for a glass and thanked me without really looking at my face. I nodded politely and moved along the row of tables, hoping the distance between us would grow again. Instead, it disappeared. A shadow crossed the marble floor in front of me. I slowed without meaning to. Something told me to look up even before I did. Adrian Moretti had stepped away from the group that had been speaking with him. He stood only a few feet away now, close enough that I could clearly see the details of his expression. His face was calm, composed, almost unreadable. Dark hair neatly brushed back, eyes sharp and steady, the kind that seemed to observe everything without missing a single detail. Up close he looked even taller than I had first thought. My breath caught slightly as I realized he was not passing by. He had stopped directly in front of me. The room behind him continued moving, guests chatting, waiters walking, the violin music flowing gently again, but the space around us felt strangely still. I lowered the tray instinctively, unsure what I was supposed to do. For a moment he said nothing. He simply studied me with the same focused attention that had followed me across the ballroom. Then one of the men in the dark suits approached quietly from behind him. The man leaned slightly toward Adrian and spoke in a low voice that I could barely hear. "Should we clear the area, sir?" The question confused me. Clear what area? Adrian did not even look back at the man. His gaze remained on me. "No," he answered calmly. His voice was deep and controlled, the kind that did not need to be loud to carry authority. It was only one word, but it seemed to settle something immediately. The man in the suit nodded and stepped back again without another question. I stood there holding the tray like an idiot, completely unsure how to react. Finally, I managed to speak. "I am sorry about earlier," I said quietly, referring to the broken glasses. "It will not happen again." For the first time, something faint shifted in Adrian Moretti's expression. Not quite a smile. more like curiosity. He glanced briefly at the tray in my hands, then back at my face. The room did not go silent because of the glasses, he said. His voice was calm, almost thoughtful. My confusion must have shown immediately because he added something that made my heart skip a beat. The room went silent because everyone was watching where I was looking. And tonight, he said slowly, I was looking at you. I did not know what to say after that. The words lingered in the air between us like something heavier than the music drifting across the ballroom. My fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray as my mind tried to catch up with what he had just said. Everyone was watching where he was looking, and he had been looking at me. That explanation should have made things clearer, but somehow it only made everything more confusing. I glanced briefly around the room. Conversations had resumed, but I could still feel the occasional curious glance drifting in our direction. People were pretending not to stare, which somehow made it obvious that they wanted to. I lowered my voice. I think they were just reacting to you entering the room, I said carefully. That seems more likely. Adrian Moretti studied me for another quiet moment, as if he found my answer interesting. Perhaps, he said calmly, but I do not think so. His tone was not arrogant. It was simply certain. I shifted my weight slightly, suddenly aware that I was still holding a tray of champagne glasses in front of one of the most intimidating men I had ever met. Would you like one? I asked, lifting the tray slightly out of habit. The question slipped out before I could stop myself. For half a second, I wondered if I had just made the most awkward mistake of my life. But Adrian glanced down at the glasses, then back at me again. No, thank you, he replied. His voice was quiet, but carried easily through the small space between us. I nodded quickly and tried to step to the side so I could continue working. Unfortunately, my path led directly past him. For a brief moment I hesitated, unsure whether it was appropriate to move around him or wait for him to move first. He solved the problem by stepping slightly aside, creating just enough room for me to pass. As I walked by, I became aware of something else. Up close, he smelled faintly of clean cologne and winter air, like he had just stepped in from the cold Manhattan night outside. It was a strange detail for my mind to focus on, but somehow it made the moment feel even more surreal. I reached the next table and carefully handed out the remaining glasses to a group of guests discussing investment strategies. They thanked me without looking up, completely absorbed in their conversation again. For a few seconds I allowed myself to breathe normally. Maybe the moment had passed. Maybe he would return to the guests who clearly expected his attention. Maybe I could finish the shift without any more embarrassing moments. Then I felt that familiar pressure again. I turned slightly and saw that Adrian Moretti had not moved very far at all. He was still standing near the same spot, speaking briefly with one of the event organizers. But even while he listened to the man talking beside him, his gaze lifted again across the room, straight toward me. I quickly looked away and focused on collecting empty glasses from another table. My thoughts were racing now. Who exactly was he, and why did everyone react to him like that? More importantly, why was he still paying attention to someone like me? I placed the empty glasses onto my tray and turned toward the service corridor near the side wall, hoping to escape the ballroom for a minute and reset my nerves. The hallway beyond the doors was quieter, dimly lit compared to the bright chandeliers behind me. I stepped inside and exhaled slowly, grateful for the moment of calm. I had only taken 2 steps down the corridor when a deep voice behind me spoke again. Emily Carter, correct. I froze. Slowly I turned around. Adrian Moretti was standing in the doorway, as if he had followed me there without making a sound. And somehow that was even more unsettling than when he had been across the ballroom watching me. I froze in the middle of the corridor, the tray still balanced in my hands as my mind tried to process what I had just heard. Emily Carter, correct. My name sounded different in his voice, calm and precise, like he had already known the answer long before asking the question. Slowly I turned around. Adrian Moretti stood a few feet away in the doorway, the bright ballroom lights behind him casting a soft glow along the edge of his dark suit. From this angle the hallway felt smaller, quieter, as if the entire building had suddenly narrowed to the space between the two of us. I stared at him for a moment before finally nodding. Yes, I said carefully. That is my name. He stepped further into the corridor, the polished marble floor barely making a sound beneath his shoes. Up close again, his presence carried the same quiet gravity that had silenced an entire room earlier. I realized something unsettling then. He did not look like a man who guessed things. He looked like a man who confirmed information he already had. How did you know that? I asked before I could stop myself. The question slipped out more directly than I intended. Adrian's expression remained calm, almost thoughtful. Your manager mentioned it when the glasses broke, he replied simply. His answer sounded reasonable enough, but something in the way he said it made me suspect he had noticed far more than just that moment. I shifted the tray slightly in my hands, suddenly aware again that I was still technically working. I should probably get back inside, I said, glancing toward the ballroom doors behind him. The music had grown louder again, and I could hear guests laughing somewhere beyond the corridor. My shift was not over yet. But Adrian did not move aside immediately. Instead, he studied me with the same steady attention that had followed me since the moment the tray fell. Do you enjoy working events like this, Emily Carter? He asked. The question caught me off guard. I blinked once before answering honestly. It pays the bills, I said. That seemed like the simplest explanation. He tilted his head slightly, considering my response. You are in school, he said. Again, it was not phrased like a question. My eyes narrowed slightly in confusion. Yes, I answered slowly. How do you know that? Adrian gestured lightly toward the small notebook tucked into the side pocket of my catering apron. I followed his gaze and suddenly remembered the stack of flashcards inside it. I had been studying between shifts all week, reviewing notes whenever there was a quiet moment during events. Psychology terms written in thick black marker. You study even while working, he said calmly. That suggests determination. I felt heat creep into my cheeks. Most people never notice things like that. They barely notice the staff at all. It is just a habit, I replied quietly. College is expensive. Silence settled between us for a brief moment. Then Adrian reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and removed a small card. The paper was thick and perfectly white, with a single name printed across the front in clean black letters. He held it out toward me. I hesitated before setting the tray on a small service table beside the wall and taking the card from his hand. The surface felt heavy, more like a piece of fine stationery than a normal business card. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, he said. His voice was calm, but carried the same quiet certainty as before. I looked up from the card, confused. For what? Adrian Moretti's expression did not change, but there was a faint hint of something behind his eyes now. Interest, maybe. Because I would like to speak with you again, Emily Carter, he said. And something told me this was not a request. I looked down at the card in my hand again, turning it slightly under the soft hallway light. The paper felt thick and expensive, the kind of detail people like me usually only noticed from a distance. Adrian Moretti. The name sat alone in clean black letters. No phone number. No title. Nothing else. Just the name. It felt strangely confident, like whoever owned that card expected people to already know the rest. I lifted my eyes slowly. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, I repeated quietly. My voice sounded unsure even to me. Yes, Adrian replied. His tone remained calm, as if the conversation had already been settled in his mind. I hesitated, still holding the card between my fingers. I am not sure that is a good idea, I admitted. The words came out more carefully than I expected. He watched me for a moment, his expression unchanged. Why not, Emily Carter, he asked. It was not an aggressive question. If anything, it sounded almost curious. I exhaled slowly and glanced back toward the ballroom doors. Music and laughter drifted through the hallway again, reminding me that the world outside this strange conversation was still moving normally. Because I do not know you, I said honestly, and you clearly know more about me than you should. For a second the corner of Adrian's mouth shifted very slightly, not quite a smile, but something close. Observation is not the same as intrusion, he said. I noticed what was already visible. That answer only made me more aware of how closely he must have been watching earlier. I looked down again at the card resting in my hand. Even if I wanted to meet him tomorrow, my schedule was not exactly flexible. I work mornings, I said, and I have classes after that. Adrian listened without interrupting. When I finished speaking, he reached into his jacket pocket again, though this time he did not pull out another card. Instead, he rested his hand lightly against the inside of the pocket, as if considering something. Then he said something that completely shifted the direction of the conversation. You study psychology, correct? I blinked in surprise. Yes, I answered slowly. How did you know that? Adrian nodded toward the small notebook still tucked into my apron pocket. When you crouched earlier, one of your flashcards fell slightly out of the notebook, he explained calmly. The word cognitive was written across the top. That narrowed the possibilities considerably. I stared at him, unsure whether to feel impressed or unsettled by how much he had noticed in such a short time. Most people at events like this never looked closely enough to remember the staff, let alone details about their notes. You pay a lot of attention to things, I said quietly. Adrian's gaze held mine steadily. Attention is a useful habit, he replied, especially when something interesting appears in a room full of predictable conversations. I was not entirely sure how to respond to that. My fingers tightened slightly around the card. And you think I am interesting? I asked. Adrian did not answer immediately. For a moment, the hallway fell quiet again except for the distant music from the ballroom. Then he spoke in the same calm voice as before. I think you are different from everyone else in that room tonight. That was not the answer I expected. I looked back toward the ballroom doors again, thinking about the expensive suits, the glittering chandeliers, the confident voices discussing investments and charities. Compared to them, I was just a student carrying trays. That does not make much sense, I said softly. Adrian took a slow step closer, though he still left a respectful distance between us. Sometimes the most important details in a room are the ones everyone else overlooks, he said. His words lingered in the air for a moment before he added something else. Tomorrow morning will give you the chance to decide whether you want to walk away from this conversation or continue it. I looked at the card again. 8 o'clock. A simple time printed in my mind now, whether I wanted it there or not. When I finally looked back up, Adrian Moretti was already turning toward the ballroom again, leaving me standing in the quiet hallway with a small white card and the uneasy feeling that something in my life had just quietly changed. For several seconds I remained standing in the hallway, staring at the card in my hand as the sound of the ballroom slowly filled the silence he had left behind. The music had returned to its soft rhythm. Glasses clinked somewhere in the distance, and people laughed as if nothing unusual had happened tonight. But something inside my chest still felt unsettled. 8:00 tomorrow morning. The number echoed in my mind as if it had been written there permanently. I slipped the card carefully into the pocket of my apron and picked up the tray again, reminding myself that I was still on the clock. Whatever strange conversation had just happened in this hallway, it did not change the fact that I still had another hour of work ahead of me. I pushed open the ballroom doors and stepped back into the bright lights and polished marble floor. Immediately the warmth of the room returned along with the quiet hum of conversation. For a moment I scanned the crowd automatically, wondering if I would see Adrian Moretti again. I did not have to search for long. He was standing near the center of the room now, speaking with a group of well-dressed guests who seemed unusually attentive to every word he said. From a distance, he looked completely at ease, one hand resting casually in his pocket while the others listened carefully. It was strange to watch him like this after the quiet conversation we had just shared in the hallway. Out here, he looked exactly like the powerful figure everyone had reacted to earlier. Confident, calm, untouchable. I turned away before he could notice me looking and moved toward a nearby table where several empty glasses had been left behind. As I collected them onto the tray, one of the other servers approached me quickly. Her name was Laura, and she had been working these events almost as long as I had. Her eyes were wide with curiosity. "Emily," she whispered urgently. "What just happened?" I blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" Laura leaned closer and lowered her voice even further. "You disappeared into the hallway with Adrian Moretti," she said. Half the room saw it. I nearly dropped the glass in my hand. "They saw that." Laura nodded quickly. "People notice when someone like him leaves the room," she explained, "especially when he follows one of the staff members." My face grew warm as I stacked the last glass onto the tray. "It was nothing important," I said quickly. "He just asked a few questions." Laura stared at me as if I had just claimed the sky was green. "A few questions," she repeated slowly. "Emily, do you know who that man is?" I hesitated before answering. "I know he is important," I admitted. Laura exhaled softly and shook her head in disbelief. "Important is one way to describe it," she said. Then she glanced across the ballroom toward where Adrian was still speaking with the guests. "My cousin works security at a building downtown," she continued quietly. "He says that when Adrian Moretti walks into a room, the owners of the building usually stand up to greet him first." I followed her gaze for a brief second before forcing myself to look away again. That sounded exaggerated, but something about the way people reacted to him tonight made it difficult to dismiss entirely. Laura studied my face carefully. "What did he want with you?" she asked. I reached into my apron pocket and felt the edge of the small card still resting there. The answer felt too strange to explain out loud. "I am not sure yet," I admitted. Laura opened her mouth to ask another question, but before she could speak, the event manager called our names from across the room, reminding us that the dessert trays needed to be served. Laura sighed and picked up a tray beside me. "Well, whatever it is," she said quietly, "you should probably be careful." I nodded, though I was not entirely sure what that meant anymore. As we walked back toward the guests, I could not stop thinking about the card in my pocket and the quiet certainty in Adrian Moretti's voice when he had said 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. And the strangest part was that even though every sensible part of my mind told me to ignore it, another part of me was already wondering what would happen if I actually showed up. I tried to focus on the work in front of me, but the rest of the night passed in a strange blur. Plates were cleared. Dessert trays were carried through the crowd. Coffee was poured into delicate white cups that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Normally, I could finish a shift like this almost on autopilot. Move from table to table. Smile politely. Stay invisible. But tonight, every small task felt slightly off balance, like my thoughts were always one step behind where they should be. The card in my apron pocket felt heavier than it should have. Every time I walked, I could feel the edge of it brushing against the fabric. 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I kept telling myself I would throw it away the moment my shift ended. That was the sensible thing to do. People like Adrian Moretti did not randomly invite catering staff to meetings. And even if they did, accepting the invitation would probably lead to complications I did not need in my life. College tuition, rent, and part-time jobs were already complicated enough. Still, every time I told myself to forget about it, I remembered the calm certainty in his voice when he handed me the card, as if the decision had already been made somewhere outside my control. Near the end of the evening, the ballroom began to thin out as guests slowly collected their coats and said their goodbyes. The violin music faded away, replaced by the quieter sounds of chairs shifting and staff preparing to clean the room. I carried the last tray of empty glasses back toward the service table near the wall and finally allowed myself to breathe out slowly. Only 15 minutes left. I could finish the shift, go home, and forget this entire strange night. As I placed the tray down, Laura appeared beside me again with the same curious expression she had worn earlier. "So," she said quietly, "did he come back to talk to you again?" I shook my head. "Not since the hallway," I replied. Laura glanced across the ballroom once more, scanning the remaining guests. "That is probably a good thing," she murmured. I followed her gaze automatically. The spot where Adrian Moretti had been standing earlier was now empty. A strange feeling passed through my chest that I could not immediately explain. Relief, maybe, or disappointment. I quickly dismissed the thought and began stacking the last of the glassware onto the cart. A few minutes later, the event manager thanked the staff and officially ended the shift. I removed the small apron from around my waist and folded it neatly before placing it into my bag. The ballroom lights were already dimming slightly as the cleaning crew began moving through the space. Guests had mostly left, and the once crowded room now felt enormous and quiet. I walked toward the main exit, my coat draped over one arm, ready to step out into the cool Manhattan night. Just before reaching the door, I slipped my hand into my bag and pulled out the small white card again. Under the softer lighting of the hallway, the black letters looked even sharper against the paper. Adrian Moretti. Nothing else. No address. No instructions. Just the time he had spoken out loud earlier. Tomorrow morning. 8 o'clock. I stared at it for a long moment before slipping it back into my bag again. Outside, the city air was crisp and carried the distant sound of traffic along the avenue. I began walking toward the subway station, telling myself again that I had already decided to ignore the invitation. But as the train roared through the tunnel and the lights of the city flashed past the windows, one thought refused to disappear. What kind of man leaves a card with nothing but his name and still seems completely certain that you will show up anyway? I told myself the decision was already made. Ignore the card. Focus on real life. Classes, rent, exams, shifts that ended past midnight, and subway rides that smelled like metal and rain. That was my world. Not quiet hallways with powerful men who spoke like every outcome had already been calculated. By the time I reached my small apartment, the city had grown calmer, the late-night traffic fading into the distant hum that never fully disappears in Manhattan. My building was old and narrow, the kind with stairs that creaked no matter how softly you stepped. I unlocked the door to my studio and flicked on the single lamp near the window. The room looked exactly the way I had left it that morning. Textbooks stacked on the small table. A half-empty mug of coffee beside a notebook full of psychology terms I still needed to memorize. My life felt normal again the moment I stepped inside. Manageable. Predictable. I told myself one more time that I was not going. That decision lasted exactly until the moment my alarm clock caught my attention on the small nightstand beside the bed. 6:45 in the morning. I stared at it for a long moment, doing the math automatically in my head. If I woke up early, I could still stop by the cafe near campus before class. 8 o'clock would only be a short detour if the meeting place was somewhere nearby. I frowned at my own thoughts and placed the card firmly on the table beside my textbooks. This was ridiculous. I was not planning my morning around a man I had met once in a hallway. With that final decision made, I turned off the lamp and lay back on the bed, letting the quiet darkness fill the room. Sleep should have come easily after such a long shift, but my mind refused to settle. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same moment again. The ballroom falling silent. Glass shattering on marble.